singing the second to last song there. I looked over at her because she was playing it right. And and so it's funny because one of the things that happens here is I want to sing it the way it's written, and Janet plays it the way she always has played it. And so when Cindy kept going, I thought, Al and Nancy are going to sing it that way because that's not the way we sing it. And so I leaned back and looked at Cindy, and she smiled at me because she knew. Different church, different situation. And poor Allison up here in her Presbyterian church, she wants to stand up.
We do a lot of standing.
They do a lot of standing in their church, but we're old people, Charlie, and so we sit down. We sit down. Now,
you looked over at me, I thought I've done something.
Listen, first of all, I know there's not a lot of us here because some of our folk are traveling and whatnot. But hey, that was pretty good for songs that we only sing one time a year.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, because of being a little kid and I was sent to church a lot, one of the services I always went to at the Methodist church was the Easter service. And so when I sing these songs, it's a nostalgia for me, being like 10 or 11 years old and sitting there and singing those songs. Even though what I said to Al this morning is, do you know all these songs that were picked because we only do them one time a year? All right, we're going to be in Mark 16. And we're going to be talking about, and I've got to turn this thing so I can read it. There we go. We're going to be talking about the resurrection. And the first question I have, which is going to go over all three services, do any of the characters who approach the tomb expect, and I'm talking about the Gospels, do they expect Jesus to be resurrected?
No.
In any of the Gospels, do they expect Jesus to be resurrected? They do not. I'm starting there because the miraculous things about Jesus, Alice and I were having a talk yesterday about primary, secondary, and tertiary things. And I agree with her that being in a multi-denominational church like this, a community church, we have so many different ideas. And so when I say about her church just standing up, I heard her say, I need to stand up. Well, I get it because, in the church that she's in, that's what you do. You hear the introduction, up we all stand. Now, if we're in a Catholic church, Charlie, we'd be getting up and down, up and down, up and down. But not just down on your behind, down on your knees, brother. Mm-hmm. And I suspect if I started that in here, we'd have problems. Now, the reason I'm mentioning all this is not to mock it, but it's what becomes important to us. And those are not primary things. What is important to us, though, is the miraculous stuff. Thinking today about Jesus, thinking today about Jesus' resurrection, although if you look at a calendar, you're going to discover that this is certainly Easter, but Resurrection Day is next month because Passover is not actually till April 22nd. Having said that, though, the miraculous things about Jesus. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Now, when you see that in John, which is the second service I'm going to be doing John, but when you see that in John, what it means is before the Father and the Son had a conversation, Jesus was equal with and shared the same essence as God. Now, I'm not going to get into a big explanation here, but that's what it says. Now, the Father speaks to the Son and says, I need a solution. So before the foundations of the world, the solution is that Jesus is going to give up the omnis. He's going to come to this earth, and he's going to be what the Bible calls the second Adam. Now, in my mind, that's one of those miracles that you just have to believe. You have to believe that Jesus comes to die for our sins. But more specifically, you have to believe that Jesus was sent, delivered up, to die for our sins. Now, the next thing is that Jesus is virgin born. A miracle. Because we have no way to know or understand as human beings how God pulls this off. But if Jesus is in fact, and I'm getting this from the book of Hebrews, if he is in fact the second Adam, then God takes some part, something from Mary. In my opinion, theology here, in my opinion, he does a creative act. And you all remember Jim Willie. Jim Willie always believed that God somehow had some kind of cosmic intercourse with Mary. I just believe, well, I'm not trying to be crude, Sue. I saw what you did, but we don't really know. But that is what Jim used to believe. I mean, he would sit and discuss this with me.
That about him.
Yeah, it was actually in a Bible study where we had quite a conversation about that. But I believe that God does a very specific creative act, and that's theology. And here comes now second Adam. That's a miracle. There's no question about it. It's a miracle. Now, somehow, miraculously, Jesus leads a sinless life. And you say, well, you're talking about us and the fact that we sinned. That's not what I'm talking about. The miracle to me about Jesus is not his ability as an adult to say no. The miracle to me about Jesus is that he doesn't do what every little kid does. The first sin every little kid commits, in my opinion, again, theology, is lying. It's the first sin every little kid commits. Now, even Brother Eddie back there, when he was a little kid, he had a mustache just like that. But when his mom and dad, and I knew his mom and dad, when his mom and dad were going to have dinner, say, and they were going to have cookies for dessert, and his mom went to get in the cookie jar and cookies were missing, and he called him and said, Edward? Is that what she called you?
She was mad, I guess.
Well, I was making that assumption.
I was older, so I always got blamed on that.
Okay. Well, there you go. Edward, did you eat those cookies? Now, as a little kid tottering around, he probably at some point did something like that. Now, Mom can look at him and see that there's a chocolate chip in his mustache or whatever it is at the time, and she can say, now, are you sure you did? I'm sure, Mom. And so to me, the miracle is not that Jesus as an adult with the power of his Father working with him doesn't commit a sin. Because we're capable of doing that as well. We are. That's not my opinion, it's what the Bible says. The fact that we don't do it doesn't mean we're not capable. But the miracle to me is that a little kid Jesus doesn't sin. That somehow there's some presence in him, with him, maybe his own presence, I don't know, because there's the miracle and he doesn't sin. Of course, the next miracle to me is the fact that he's willing to die. Father, all things are possible with you. Put the other way, nothing is impossible with you. Then, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But the miracle to me is we're always looking for a way out. And Jesus says, it's enough. And then the next miracle that we have to believe in is what we're talking about today, and that's the resurrection. We have to believe in that. Al and I were talking about the nonsense that goes on in our country, here in the United States, and around the world as far as that goes, Europe too, where people celebrate Easter, but don't believe in the resurrection. That makes no sense in my head. But we're in good company when we behave like that because of this question. When you read all four Gospels, or the three Gospels in John's treatise, what you discover is not one of them, not a single person going to that tomb expects Jesus to be resurrected. What in all the Gospels they do expect to see is a stone in the way. We're going to talk about this in the second service, because in the second service we're going to discuss some of the symbolism that John uses and why it matters. Because I'm of a mind that our testimony really does matter. It is important that as a believer, I go out and tell people that I believe in all the miracles I just talked about. I believe in those miracles. Because if I don't believe in those miracles, I'm not sure why I'm sitting in this church. Because if I need self-help, I can go right down to Barnes & Noble and find all kinds of books about that. Or if I need self-help, I can find some life coach on YouTube who can help me out. But I don't need self-help. I don't need a life coach. I need a Savior. That's what I need. And part and parcel of that Savior is someone who goes ahead of me, which is what your pastor, I think, was talking about on Friday, where somebody goes ahead of me and prepares a place for me so that when I get there, there's going to be a place for me, so that he can come back and receive me unto himself. And the only way that works is if he's resurrected. Now, with all of that in mind, and understanding that in John's treatise, that's where I'm getting that I go to prepare a place for you thing. In John's treatise, Jesus says that to them. And it's interesting that after telling Peter, look, you're going to deny me, Peter says, no, I'm not. Jesus says, yes, you are, but don't worry about it, because I'm going to go and prepare a place for you. Then you have Philip stepping up. Philip, this will be the guy who I was talking about Wednesday, who goes and finds Mark, comes back with that bread, comes back with that fish, and then watches as Jesus takes those bread and fish, breaks them up, and feeds over 5,000 people. certainly a miracle, and you sit here and say, well, I don't believe it. Then I don't know how you can believe in God. Because God operates outside of our physics. He just does. He just does. So here in Mark 16 now, we're ready to talk about Mary, because the single thing I said is going to apply to everything we talk about today. Now when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they might come and anoint him. Why?
Because they expected him to still be in the grave.
All right, that's the first answer. They bought the spices because they expected him to be there. Now, Charlie, you picked an interesting Sunday to come because of this. Doris would go and buy spices, and she would go to the tomb. And the reason she would do it, Charlie, is because she didn't believe that you and I knew how to prepare Jesus' body when we stuck him in the tomb. Now, I know you don't know what I mean, but now I'm going to explain it. When Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea take the body, think about Wednesday night service, what do? When they take the body, what do? All right, they prepare it for burial. How?
They wrap it.
They wrapped it up, but you're missing a glaring thing here. There you go. They went out and they rapidly bought spices, and the thing that they bought, it's kind of complicated, but think of it like almost like a lotion, if you will. But they slathered it all over Jesus' body. Because when you read the Gospels, what's interesting about it is we're not talking about whatever it was she was putting on her legs this morning that made me sneeze. She needed help putting her shoes on. I bent over to help her put her shoes on, and all of a sudden I'm sneezing, and I said something bit me, and she says that must have been the Neutrogena I put on. We're not talking about a little palm full of oil here. We are talking, according to the Gospels, about 100 pounds of stuff. And they smear it all over his body before they wrap it up. This is Joseph and Nicodemus. Why do they do that? Preserve it, and her answer is the one that's most on target: decay. Remember, when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, what are the people worried about? They say, surely he what?
Stinks.
He stinks. It's been days. Jesus, do you see a refrigeration unit on the outside of that cave? They expected him to smell. So when they prepared Jesus' body, and this will be the guys, Charlie, I just need you to understand how women think about you and me. This is how Shelley thinks about me. It's how Doris thinks about you. They think we don't know what we're doing. I mean, you and I discussed shaving this morning, and I thought to myself while we were talking, I have a Bakelite handled straight razor at my house. I'm going to give it to her, and I'm going to let her shave you. But just be sure you're behaving yourself before she does. So the reason I spent all that time talking about it is these women, and there's three of them here in this story, Mary, and Salome, they go and buy spices. Excuse me. And they come now, and they're going to do it right. Because Joseph and Nicodemus, in their minds, did it wrong. And the reason was, they're only men. You just have to understand they're only men. Cindy disagrees. Okay. So they come to anoint him, and she's going to want to talk about the respect part of it, which makes sense. Because another detail that never gets taught on Resurrection Day, but this should be fun, is are these three the first ones to anoint Jesus?
No.
They are not. So who is the first one? Who?
Oh, Mary with the long hair.
There you go. The light bulb went off over here. I saw it. And it was Mary with the long hair. Mary, the one who washes Jesus' feet. Mary of the alabaster box. You say, why are you making a big deal out of it? Because of what we're going to talk about in the second service and how important testimony is. Because when Mary of the long hair, Mary of the alabaster box comes into Jesus, he's sitting with a Pharisee. And I'm going to go with Luke here because I'm not really interested in what John has to say, because in my opinion, John is perpetually, when he writes that treatise, looking for scapegoats. Judas over and over again, and Pontius Pilate. But when you think about what the others say. She comes in, she cries, washes his feet, she breaks the alabaster box, she anoints him. They react badly. And according to everybody but John, it's all of them that react badly. All of the disciples say, hold on a minute. She's being wasteful. If you've ever been in a conservative church, you've been down this pathway. She's being wasteful. That thing could have been sold. We could have raised money. We could have given it to the poor. Now, John's treatise says it was Judas. The synoptics say, no. It was all of them. Jesus' reaction to all of them is, fellas, she's doing this because of my death. So here again, same principle. Verse 2. So very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they said among themselves, who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us? Clearly, those three women expected to find Jesus' body in the tomb. Now, the shorthand of this thing is, and a lot of ministers will do this, we're so quick to get Jesus out of the tomb. We're so quick not to pay attention to details which really, really matter. In the second service, we're going to discuss a detail about how the clothes are folded. Now, these writers are writing with purpose, because when Allison and I were talking yesterday about primary, secondary, and tertiary issues in the Bible, one of the things we were discussing is between the four, you get some contradictions if you want to read it that way. Atheists, agnostics, and even doubter believers sitting in the church are going to say, but can you not see this difference? The answer is, yeah, I can see the difference. But let's start with the real issue here. These people who sat under Jesus' tutelage for at least 3 years, some of them less, these people who listen to Jesus say, you knock this down, on the third day it's going to be raised, these people who were clearly instructed that Jesus had to die so that the Father could bring him back, these people who heard Jesus say the sign of Jonah didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. They went, Cindy's argument, they went to anoint his body. They went because some of them thought the boys didn't do it right. So when they get there, their first thought is, we can't roll the stone away. What are we going to do? How are we going to get to him? So we continue. Verse 4. But they looked up, they saw the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. Now, they had to have been aware that it was there. And what's interesting to me is not any of these narratives talk about this, but let's be honest about it. The Bible doesn't record every single detail. And when I read all four of the records of this thing, one of the things that's interesting to me is they comment again and again and again about the size of the stone. But if you just read the narratives, what characters would have known that stone was there? The soldiers of the garden would have known. Who else would have known? And I'm talking about known. Who would have known that stone was there? Joseph and Nicodemus. Yet these women, on approaching the thing, they knew it was there.
But wouldn't they know culturally, like that's what they did?
All right, she's wanting to know when they know culturally that that's what they did. Part of the answer to that question is yes. But I'm going to add a supposition to this, which would be theology. And that is, do you honestly believe that no one, from the time he dies on the cross until this event, do you honestly believe that no one went to look?
Well, didn't
Loud enough that can hear you.
Well, in one of the accounts, didn't somebody say, make sure that stone is there?
Yeah, which you have, and what she's asking is a great question, but it has nothing to do with the characters that we're discussing. But you're right about that the instruction was given to the Roman soldiers. You make sure the stone is there. You make sure that stone stays. But what's intriguing to me is that all four of these have this record of them knowing the stone is there before they get there. Now, I don't honestly believe for an instant that either Nicodemus or Joseph went and said to the disciples, hey, we put him in the tomb. Hey, there's a stone there. I think that they crept out, because when you're really in love with somebody, I'm going to use this, Bud, even though you're not here in the second service. When you're really in love with somebody, then you're really in love with somebody. Could Mary stand not to go? Could she stand not to at least go and have a look? I'm not talking about going into the tomb. I'm just talking about going to the tomb.
Don't you think when they took him?
Loud enough that I can hear you.
Don't you think when they took him off the cross and carried him to the tomb, there were some followers?
There probably were, but at that point when they're sticking him in the tomb, Joseph and Nicodemus have to leave right away, because remember, and that was the context I was trying to use Wednesday night, that Nicodemus and Joseph didn't hang around to see the stone put there because they had to worry about Passover. Remember, one is a great theologian, the greatest teacher according to Jesus of his time. The other guy was whoever Joseph of Arimathea was. And so they didn't hang around. They had to get undercover. I have to believe, and again, it's theology. I'm freely owning this, that they had to creep out and go, is he okay? Because when you really love somebody, is he okay? Come on, if you're a parent and you're trying to get hold of your kid, and some of you are going to have to go back a long way, Sue.
Yeah, as far as you.
Well, Dave's not here, but he'll listen to this and he'll laugh because he heard me say that, because I know Dave listens to the services. But if you look way back there, when and I mean way back in your case, looking back to when your kids were little, think about when they weren't there. Or think about when you called and you couldn't get hold of them. You really love them. It was why when Bailey called and she said, Dad, I need your help, you all laughed and you understood what I thought immediately was, man, I can come and rescue you, but it's going to take me a minute or two. But having said that, that need, that desperation, more for her than me, because I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be a solution to the problem, where I could tell that Shelley was just, and she had a bad day yesterday anyway, I could tell that she was just, because when you really love somebody, and you say, why do you keep belaboring it? Because now it makes sense when they're walking. Oh, yeah, the stone. Because I don't see Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea going back and saying to them, hey, don't bother going to the tomb. How are you going to keep somebody away when that person really, really loves somebody? How are you going to do it? So we continue on now. The stone is very large. They know it. Somebody knew it. So they get there, and they see that the stone is rolled away. And they enter the tomb, and there's actually, and I'm going to have to say this because of the second service, there's an antechamber and then where the tomb actually is. So they enter the tomb, according to this. They see a young man clothed in a long white robe sitting on the right side. Now, I'm going to say something before I'll just say this. They were alarmed. Now, I spent a lot of time reading about this because I'm always intrigued what other people think about this. Because one of the contradictions in the Gospels is who was sitting in the tomb. Was it two guys or one guy? Was it two angels or one angel? Well, first of all, I can help you with part of that. The word angel actually means messenger. See, they know. The word angel actually means messenger. So there's no contradiction here when some agnostics and atheists come along and they say, well, here's my problem. You people can't get it together. The other thing that I found interesting, and I don't agree with this, but I did find it interesting, people that are trying to explain the Bible away say, well, it was some Essenes that had an inside track. And so that's who rolled the stone away. And no, I'm serious about this. I mean, I'll send it to you if you want to read it.
I'm curious.
Because I read it and they said, well, it was these Essenes that would have been like John the Baptist, because John the Baptist would have been an Essene, and they came and they sat in there and they were the ones. No, this is a supernatural event. God provided. And when you read these, you realize that it seems like people came at different times. Now, having said this, when they look in, they're stunned, alarmed, in fact, to find that there's a guy in there, because there's always a guy, sitting in there with a long white robe. Now, white robe suggests purity, and it suggests a whole lot of different things. But I have a question about this as a believer. The first barrier they saw coming up was what? I already talked about it. The stone. Now, the second barrier they have, thinking about all four of the accounts, is what? What's the second barrier? They can go in and they can look, but what's the barrier? We're talking about faith here. What's the barrier?
He's not there.
That's the right answer depending on what you mean. He's not there. Now go one step further. On the temporal plane, as a human being, he's not there. So rationally, the way human beings think, what is our assumption?
Someone stole the body.
Somebody stole the body. There was a guy.
Yeah.
Well, no, it would have taken two guys to do that. Now, the reason I'm belaboring the point is when you read the Gospels, they make a whole lot more sense when you realize that as much as we teachers, and I'm not a preacher, so, the people that do that, we all want to say they went in and they went, oh, he's risen. Read the accounts. They went in, he wasn't there, and their first reaction is, who took the body? And you sit here today in 2024 and you say, I don't know what was wrong with it. The same thing that's wrong with us. Because when Al and I were talking this morning about holidays, I said it fascinates me no end that this whole country celebrates Easter. But the vast majority of this country, including many people sitting in churches, don't believe in the resurrection. If you don't, why are you here? Why are you here? Now, I'm not being cavalier and saying that if I had been there and walked in, I would have said, you know what, guys, you have this all wrong. He's resurrected. No. What I am saying, though, is these stories are here for a purpose. Now, a long, long time ago, when Allison and I were having a conversation about the Bible, and this was a long, long time ago, I had said back here in this office that to me, the Bible is nothing more than a collection of cautionary tales, which she didn't like, and that would be a secondary issue, possibly a tertiary issue. But having said that, we learn by listening. And we also learn, if we're intelligent, by other people's experiences. And I'm not talking about to be pulled down. I'm talking about to be pulled up. Here we have 3 women standing in a tomb that's empty. The reason this guy is here is they need to know something. I would love to know, and the Bible doesn't account because Mark writes like Hemingway, so it's bang, 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 bang. But I would love to know if this was a play, how much time passed from the time the 3 of those looked in there and saw him to the point where anybody said, anybody got anything to say? Verse 6. So the guy speaks first, and he says, don't be alarmed. When Jesus is living, he says the same thing a lot. Don't be afraid. It's all right. I'm going to tell you right now, I would be alarmed. I would be very alarmed. I would be startlingly alarmed. If somebody appeared right there, right now, in glistening white clothes, I would be alarmed. And the reason is, miracles are all about things that break every concept we have about physics. I did not put this question up there, but I do want to discuss it. And that is this. Is the purpose of these 4 accounts to provide proof? Is that the purpose of it?
No.
I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is faith is the substance of things hoped for. Faith is the evidence of things, what? Not seen. And there they are. And here's this guy, because there's always a guy. And he says, don't be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He is risen. Now, Mark, in recording that, does something interesting. Can you see it? Now, this is making the assumption from Bible studies, but can you see it? Do not be alarmed, and this is what I'm interested in. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. What's Mark doing that's interesting? Okay, he's affirming that Jesus is risen, but look at the name he drops on Jesus.
Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus of Nazareth. Mark chooses in this instance to identify Jesus not as God's Christ, but rather as the temporal Jesus. Mm-hmm. You came here to look for the Jesus that you know who was living in Nazareth with his mom and dad. But that Jesus isn't here. He's risen. This is one of those times, and this goes all the way back to, back to when we were doing stuff in churches. This is one of those times when I would like to have a hibachi over here burning with nice hot coals and a big pitcher of sweet tea on this side, and then say to the whole congregation, before God and everything else, choose you this day whom you will serve. Is he risen or is he not? Decide. Because this is not one of those issues that we can sit in a church and say, well, I'm not sure. You either believe God or you don't believe God. Because this is not Jesus providing the evidence for himself. This is one of God's messengers telling, look, he's not here. The one that you've been thinking about, the one that you came to anoint, that would be Jesus of Nazareth, the temporal body, isn't here. Because God's Christ, notice my shift, because God's Christ is risen, because God is not going to leave his son here. See, it wasn't just the spirit of Jesus that was put into God's hands. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It was also his very body. And the reason it matters is because of what her pastor talked about on Friday. If this didn't happen, this is a college, not a church. There's no point in singing the Easter songs we sang. There's no point in singing He is Lord, because he's not risen from the dead. And if he's not risen from the dead, he's not alive. And if he's not alive, then he can't be the authority figure of our lives. Now, the couple of questions I've ignored so far. According to Mark, why was Mary at the tomb? Why was she there? To anoint the body, fully expecting Jesus of Nazareth to be there. All right, so how do these gospel accounts, and all four of them, because I've been discussing this, show us that the believers didn't understand the resurrection? How do they show that they didn't understand?
They just didn't believe it.
Well, they didn't believe it because it's too colossal to believe. There are times even in our own lives where it's almost impossible to believe. I can't speak for any of you, but let's talk about something we have evidence of. It is almost impossible for me to believe because I've driven across the Key Bridge. It's almost impossible for me to believe that a ship hit that thing and it collapsed. Almost impossible for me to believe that. Because I look at the structure, and because of our human faith, we drive over something like that, the same as the Golden Gate Bridge or whatever. We drive over that, we drive over that, we drive over that, and we assume it's going to be okay. And you say, but it was a huge ship with all the stuff that was in it. I hear you.
But they had passed before.
Ships have been by there before. Stuff had bumped into that before. It's almost impossible to believe. And this is a temporal thing. So I am not the guy who's going to tell you, yeah, if I'd have been there, I'd have believed it. So when the Gospels talk about this, they had some idea about this, but not really. Not really, because it was beyond their scope. But I have a question about that in regard to Wednesday night's study. Can you see a contradiction there when you think about Lazarus? Have they ever seen an example where somebody who was dead was suddenly alive again?
They did, yeah.
They did. But the difference is here, he is risen. He is not here. Lazarus was there. Jesus is not. See the place where they laid him. So the messenger invites them to have a look. Then this, but go tell his disciples and Pete that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he said to you. And what's interesting about this is they are given a very clear and specific command. What are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to do? Go tell who?
Peter.
Well, Peter was isolated, but they were supposed to go tell who? His disciples. Don't confuse this with apostles. Disciples, there would have been way more. So therefore, and I don't know where your pastor landed in 1 Corinthians 15, but if he had gone through the whole thing, he appeared to this one, he appeared to these, he appeared to those, he appeared to this many. This could be a great example of that. Because it wasn't just 12 or 11 guys. It wasn't just 11 guys. You go and tell his disciples, but make sure Peter knows. Now, the reason it's important that Peter knows if you're reading Mark's gospel is because it's in Mark's gospel that we read this thing, upon this rock I will build my church. And I want to be clear about this because somebody was talking to me this week about, Peter being the first pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Bless your heart. It's not talking about the person, it's talking about the testimony. Seriously. And so when somebody's talking about this week and they're pushing the idea that, yes, Peter was the first pope and we were discussing why that matters, what matters is not that. It is Peter's testimony. Peter's testimony was, everybody else says you're a prophet, everybody else says you're Jesus of Nazareth. I'm sitting dead down in Mark, so this is contextual. Everybody says that you're Elijah, or you're this one, or you're Moses, or you're this one, or you're that one. And then Peter says this, and this is the testimony upon which the church is built. But you are the Son of the living, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Man, if that can't excite you, then you don't know what it is to be a believer. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The reason I'm mentioning this at all is when you walk through Mark 8, pay attention to what happens. Jesus says, you're exactly right, Pete. You're exactly right about that. That's who I am. And upon your testimony, upon that rock of testimony, I will build my church. One of the reasons that the church is no longer being built to the glory of God is we don't want to build on that truth. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. If it was Jesus's church, that's what would matter. In somebody else's church, the rules matter. I got to tell you, in the area of miracles, the rules don't matter. That's why they're miracles. So Pete turns around and Jesus makes a remark right after that. And he says, he says, so now that you've said this, I'm going to have to die. And what does Pete say? You're not going to have to die. What does Jesus say back? I would love to have been there for that conversation. I love you, Pete. Pete, you're the devil. One conversation where he goes both directions with this. Pete says, no, you're not going to die. And then he switches out on him. He says, look, Simon, I got news for you. I'm going to die, and here we go, and I'm going to be raised up. This and that match up. So he tells him to go, and what's interesting here is he tells him to go into Galilee. This is important to tonight's service, contextually. He says, you go, and you tell them, I'm going to run ahead of them to Galilee. That's where you're going to see him. And this is what you need to know. Now, verse 8 is this question. Why do the believers run away rather than going into town like the shepherds did at the birth of Jesus? Why do they run away?
They still didn't believe it.
Because they still didn't trust him, but there was a whole other problem there. Why did they run away?
They were scared.
They were scared witless. Because already Jesus dies by claiming, I am the bread, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, I am the this, I am the that. And for them to go back in after him just being crucified 3 days ago and say, hey, I know that this doesn't fit anybody's cosmology, but I really need to let you know, they ran away. It says, so they went out, the word quickly doesn't belong there. They went out and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed in their ecstasy and whatever all else. And they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, if you're looking at a Bible before I finish this verse, and it's anything but a King James Bible, and you look in the margin, you're going to see where it says that from verse 9 from verse 9 to the end of this book was added. After this was all put together, they added verses 9 through 20. Can anybody guess why? Why would they add that after verse 8 if Mark's gospel in the best and oldest manuscripts ends in verse 8? Why would they add to it? That's a good answer. But probably not for the reason you mean. But you're right. Expand on the idea. You're smart. She said closure.
I mean,
There's no way to be wrong here.
I know, I'm afraid to answer. Well, just because
I do it to my own family too, Dave.
it ends with them running and hiding, and depending on when those verses were added, you want to be cool with the gang, and you want to have Jesus appear.
Did you say cool in the gang?
Cool with the gang?
Listen, Ron and I know.
The other gospels have the beautiful moment in the Great Commission, and if all the books in all the world can't capture
You need to do a
everything.
church service. That's exactly right.
But yeah, it's so like all the other ones have it. I'm like, oh, but Mark ended with them hiding. Okay, let's just add in this extra stuff.
Now, I understand.
Tie up the bow.
Well, there you go. That's another way of saying it much more concisely. Her answer was exactly right. If you're looking at anything other than a King James Bible, it's going to say that the text is spurious or it was tacked on. And if you want to know where they got it from, so I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm not saying that it's not in the Bible somewhere. Although Paul, in Acts, uses a lot of this in his own teaching. She's right. Mark's gospel, in its best and oldest manuscripts, ends in verse 8. But the problem with it is this the thing that we want to go out and tell the world when we're trying to win them for Jesus? Is this the thing that we want to go out and tell everybody about Jesus' own disciples? That they ran into the hills, they never bothered to tell anybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to start adding things in, and we're going to pull from other sources. And what we're going to say at the end of the day is, you know what? When you believe in Jesus and God's Spirit is in you, you can pick up snakes and run around handling them. That's part of this. You're going to be able to go down to Cleveland, Tennessee and drink poison out of mason jars, and it'll be fine. I'm not making that up. There are churches that really say, Sister Marilyn, if you're spiritual, if you're really, no, not you. You would do this to me. I would never do this to you because I love you. And you know that. But if I was really spiritual, Charlie, and there's a whole church that teaches this. If I was really spiritual, instead of her putting coffee in this cup this morning, and I'm pretty sure it's coffee, or at least it tastes like it, she would put poison in here just to see if I was spiritual. And if I could get through this whole service while I was drinking this and not drop dead, I'm spiritual. I'm not kidding. There are churches today and denominations today that they say, based on what says in the rest of this book, you can pick up snakes and handle them, and if you get bit, you're not going to die. You can drink poison. Some of you are nodding at me because you know this stuff. And this is why there are agnostics and atheists running around in the country, because they're saying, sort of the little dog, not the big dog. The little dog will look at me and go, and I'll talk to him. Because what he really wants to know is, I'm really going to take him out, or I'm just going to keep talking to him. See, I do to the dogs what I do to you all. I just keep talking. And I'm not demeaning this, and I'm not saying you can't find it in other places, but what Allison said is true. She said tying up the bow, closure. It would be hard for us to end here in modern times and say, man, these are the first people, and they ran away. How am I supposed to go to the Chinese restaurant this afternoon and talk about Jesus? But if we're true believers, we will. They run away because they're scared out of their wits. But there's another detail that gets lost that is very important to us in 2024, and that is they defy what they're told. Go tell the disciples. Now I'm going to harmonize this with one of the other Gospels right here in a way that I never read, but it's the way that makes most sense to me. In verse 1, you notice, and I'm setting myself for the second service here. In the first verse of this particular account, you notice that Mary Magdalene was one of the folk that was traveling along. Not Mary, which would be Mary Lazarus' Mary. Not that Mary. This is a different Mary. This is Mary that's the mother of James. Is trafficking along here. But when we study John's gospel, almost the first thing that happens in that gospel is Mary Magdalene runs back. Now I read over and over again, well clearly here, Mary ran back the instant she heard this, but that's not what this says. So let's not twist it up, let's teach it on its face. When the girls start to run away, why could it not be that Mary Magdalene is with them and then all of a sudden goes, weren't we told to do something? And break away and head back. And she doesn't tell all the disciples, but according to John, she tells, nobody knows. She tells Pete. And then of course Ian, that would be English for John, is hanging on and he goes back with Peter. So we don't have to try and twist this up where one runs away, the other stay. But you can see where they all go away. And you say, but we never see that in the Bible, don't we? Jesus, in one of the great acts of compassion in the Bible, in my opinion, runs up on 10 guys. Because there's always a group of guys. And when he runs up on the 10 guys, these 10 guys have a problem. And do you want to do this? The 10 guys' fingers are falling off, and their toes are falling off, and they're a little ashy. Put in biblical terms, they have leprosy. They ask Jesus to heal them, and Jesus does. All 10 of them, at Jesus' instruction, start heading the other way. But one of them on the way takes a look at his skin and says, hold on a minute. I'm better. And he goes back. That testimony matters. Now, the reason it happens is because the other 9 were in a hurry to get to the priest so that they could be free. The one guy who comes back is not Jewish. And so he's got to express his gratitude to someone. And why not the one who made it better? And so that's why, when we read this, I think Mary ran back, and therefore when we read all 4 of these accounts, she's the one person. Because when you love somebody, she's the one person that he sees and talks to that morning. Any questions or comments about this? They'll dovetail together, trust me. Let's pray.